Benjamin Netanyahu has hung on to power in Israel. And this really shouldn't come as much of a surprise to anybody. It was a very tight election. And his primary opponent in the election was not running with any kind of fundamental strategic alternative to Netanyahu's position. That's a really important thing to highlight here, because the stylistic concern that Netanyahu is totally alienated, as an example, like the center left, broadly speaking, or that Israel should sort of pretend to have a sort of more respectful relationship to the United States, no matter who's in power. That's the standard issue position of, as an example, even just like the security establishment in Israel. You're much more likely to hear a former Mossad leader or a defense official, even potentially more substantively acknowledge that, as an example, the Iran deal was working, that it was effective, even though they had problems with it and they shouldn't undermine it, or even make a sort of occasional tip of the hat to doing something about the Palestinians. This was not in the election. What was in the election was Netanyahu running clearly on essentially formalizing apartheid and also most likely exchanging a deal with prospective coalition partners to make himself immune from criminal prosecution, because he's under indictment right now. Let's go to two different reactions to his win. We'll start with Trump, and then we'll go to the Palestinian analyst Diana Butzo, and we'll come back and go from there.
Say it. So the fact that Bibi won, I think we'll see some pretty good action in terms of peace. Look, everyone said, and I never made it a promise, but everybody said you can't have peace in the Middle East with Israel and the Palestinians. I think we have a chance, and I think we have now a better chance with Bibi having won. Yes, please.
So there is a possibility that, as Professor Juan Cole talked about, that there is a new Saudi initiative that is very different from the one in 2003. The one in 2003 was a Saudi proposal that ended up going nowhere. Essentially, if the Israelis withdrew from the West Bank and Gaza, if they created a genuine two-state solution along 67 borders, then the Saudis would lead the rest of the Arab world in recognizing Israel. The dynamic we're in now is that Israel informally has very tight connections with Saudis, with the Emirates. Obviously, they already have diplomatic relations with Jordan and Egypt. And the preoccupation and overwhelming focus of both Israel and particularly the Saudis is Iran. And there's really no problem with selling out the Palestinians in the process. It's not like there's any sincere concern from any of these parties about, liberating the Palestinians from the Israelis. So so a peace deal could mean, some type of, I don't even know how they'll phrase it, but it will be no delivery for the Palestinians. It will just be a sort of formalization of subjugation, even if it's called a state, which I at this point even doubt. And then it will be, well, no, we delivered a region-wide peace deal. And that can, of course, be sold as something bigger and better and more bold and ambitious and so on. Now, it does remain to be seen, because I think a deal like that actually could set off another wave of political unrest across the region. This is Diana Butzo on Democracy Now!
And we're also joined by Diana Butzu, a Palestinian attorney, has been an advisor to President Mahmoud Abbas in negotiations with Israel. Your reaction to the elections, and also to what appears to be a historically low turnout by the Palestinian citizens of Israel, what the significance of that is?
But in terms of the reaction vis-a-vis the outcome that we've seen, this was in effect, for Palestinians at least, this was an election in which you either choose Trump or you choose Trump. The positions that both Likud took and Benny Gantz took were virtually indistinguishable, particularly when it came to Palestinians. They bragged about how much they were going to beat up on Palestinians, and then took their voters as a result. So it's not at all surprising that we see this outcome, given that we really had two candidates that were quite mirroring one another when it came to this election. In terms of the voter turnout, there were a number of factors in terms of low Palestinian voter turnout. One was the fact that a number of people have ideologically chosen to boycott, and then others was because there was a level of voter intimidation and people also believing that their MKs, their members of Knesset, were unable to deliver. The big problem, however, is that we've seen a rise in fascism in Israel, and instead of people boycotting, we were hoping to see that people would have come out in greater numbers to try to at least push back against that tide. As it stands right now, although the ballots have not been completely counted, we really only have about 15 out of 120 members of Knesset who believe in equality and who believe in an end to the occupation. And that's a very sad indication of where Israel is.
Diana Boutou, can you explain who can vote in the Israeli elections and who can't, and also respond to these 1,200 cameras being put in the election booths, the polling places in Arab neighborhoods?
Yes, definitely. In terms of who can vote, it's only citizens of Israel who are allowed to vote. And so of that citizenry, about 16% of the people who are eligible to vote are Palestinians who are citizens of Israel. But then you look at the vast remainder of people that Israel controls, whether it's people who live in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, or in Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem. You're looking at close to 6 million individuals who are ineligible to vote in Israeli elections and yet are being governed by Israel. In terms of the cameras, this is not only a violation of Israeli law, but it was something that the Israeli Prime Minister brazenly is supporting and had came out and said, yes, we shouldn't be worried about this. There should be cameras in all polling stations. The reason this, of course, is so alarming is the fact that this leads to voter intimidation. There are a number of Palestinians who are working either as teachers, as in other ministries, and who, seeing that there is a camera in place, feel rightfully so that their votes are being monitored, whether they show up to the polls or who it is that they're going to be voting for. And so this type of voter intimidation is the type of action that Netanyahu has done not only when it came to this election, but in previous elections where he tried to claim that Arabs were, quote, voting in droves. He's ideologically opposed to Palestinian freedom, ideologically opposed to Palestinians having equality, and will do anything that it takes to try to intimidate and to try to make sure that there is perpetual control over Palestinian lives.
That's absolutely true. That's an objective statement. And the parties that are rising in Israel, if anything, are even more extreme than Netanyahu and certainly synchronized with him. But I think it's really important, and I'll loop back to some of the results in a second, but this is not just Netanyahu. So it's encouraging that a Beto O'Rourke or a Pete Buttigieg have criticized him. Obviously, Sanders has led the way in this, but now there's, and again, several candidates didn't go to AIPAC. Sanders was the only one who specifically identified why he didn't go to AIPAC. So he still stands apart and is better than the other candidates on this vital issue. But if you frame it, and I mentioned this yesterday, Netanyahu, yes, is a monster. He's a leader in the authoritarian trend. He's an apartheidist. He's a bigot. He's a repugnant individual to anybody with human values. But unfortunately, he is in the center, clearly, of Israeli politics. He's going to surpass David Ben-Gurion in terms of length of leadership of this country. And I'm going to quote now from the New York Times, because this write-up is an accurate reflection of how a primarily very hard right, very unconcerned about these issues that we might be concerned about in terms of justice or equity, Israeli electorate is voting. And also the dire state of and my unbelievable sympathies for any part of the Israeli left, which, yes, the joint list still did manage to send some people in parliament. I'll get to that in a second. But quoting now from the New York Times, though in many ways they have Benjamin Netanyahu's apparent reelection as Prime Minister of Israel attests to a starkly conservative vision of the Jewish state and about its people, where they are and where they are headed. They prize stability as well as military and economic security that Mr. Netanyahu has delivered. They are in many ways never been safer, though they remain afraid, especially of Iran and its influence over their neighbors, against which Mr. Netanyahu has relentlessly crusaded. They are persuaded by his portrayal of those who challenge him, whether Arab citizens or the left, as enemies of the state, and they take his resemblance to authoritarian leaders around the world as evidence that he was ahead of the curve. They credit Mr. Netanyahu, whose strategic vision values power and fortitude above all, with piloting Israel to unprecedented diplomatic heights, and they believe still more is possible, and they loathe to let anyone less experienced take controls. Let's be honest with ourselves, said Michael B. Orn, a former Israeli ambassador to Washington. Our economy is excellent. Our foreign relations have never been better. We're secure. We've got a guy in politics for 40 years. We know him. The world knows him. And even our enemies know him. So that is a really perfect reflection of most of, again, still the majority of the Israeli electorate. This was a much tighter race. But as Diana Buto pointed out, I mean, Benny Gantz is a former military chief. He presided over the atrocities of Gaza of 2014. He bragged about his brutality against the Palestinians. There's no daylight here. There isn't even the old sort of like two-state quasi-peace process versus full apartheid daylight. And even then that was always suspect because settlements had always expanded under labor governments. So the next step of how to actually talk about this and figure this out is going to mean that Netanyahu actually can't just be a stand-in for a fuller and honest actual accounting of what Israeli politics is. And there's a reason he keeps winning. There's a reason that the left is totally marginalized there, even the center left like Moretz, and that labor is essentially irrelevant and offers critiques on the economy, which, by the way, I don't know how strong the Israeli economy is. It's built on a lot of the same fundamental inequalities and bubbles that the rest of the neoliberal world is. Israel tracks the whole Western order with that. And part of the reason, the last thing I'll leave you with, is that the broader critique of Israel is harder, not just because of all of the things that people talk about that are real. Of course, there's an Israel lobby, like there's a Saudi lobby and all sorts of other lobbies that influence power and exertion. And of course, there's people's absolutely rightful concern about the history of anti-Semitism and how we discuss and talk about Israel. But there's also the reality that someone like Jeff Halper will put forward that Israel is a microcosm of how the Western world, for lack of a better term, is managing the fallout of today's global economy and power relations. So that if you start to look at the U.S. role in Afghanistan, that continues to this day. If you look at Iraq, if you look at all sorts of insurgencies and counterinsurgencies and drone programs and the merging of military and policing at home and internationally, you can start to look at the savagery and management of Gaza as a microcosm and a showcase for how all of those relationships work. And it's very literal. I mean, Israel, there's a reason Israel is a prime security systems and weapons exporter in the world. That oppression, that dynamic is an advertisement for security policies, for weapons, for population control. There's a reason that Israeli companies are involved in things like detention centers. There's a reason that going back to the 1980s, some of the things that we talk about that Reagan supported in Central America, some of the death squads and mass killings in places like Guatemala and El Salvador also included flying in Israeli trainers. So Israel has also become a showcase for this broader barbarism of this relationship. And that critique is going to go far beyond Netanyahu, and it's going to implicate all of us. So that's the sort of big picture around that election. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
I think that was all pretty good. I would just reiterate that Israel, I feel like it's mask off time for Israel. You know, like
Definitely.
they can't keep playing this game about how, oh, it's the only democracy in the Middle East and we have
just such an
human
insult.
rights and gay rights and stuff. Like, no, I think more and more Americans are waking up to the fact that that's not true. It is I mean, okay, it's complicated. Definitely. But I feel like sometimes people use that as a cop-out to avoid taking a position on it. And some aspects of it are not that complicated. Like if you have a population of people that is subject to your domination who don't have citizenship rights and don't get to vote, it's not a democracy.
Period. And nothing complicated. Don't let people use the complicated evasion with you on this. It's not. I mean, how you actually solve a problem like this and the logistics of it and the culture of it and the politics and the economics, yes, that's complicated. But the basic analysis of this situation, anybody says that it's complicated, they're either totally ignorant or they're trying to hustle you. It's nonsense. The actualities of the reality are quite clear. And again, I mean, look, if you put the shoe, if you flip the situation, and there was a group of Jewish people that lived in two disparate pieces of land, they were kicked off, hundreds of thousands of people were kicked off of their homes to begin with. They're in these small slots controlled by another state and regularly killed and have second-class citizenship. We would be rightfully appalled at like the greatest currently existing act of anti-Jewish violence and oppression on the planet. I mean, there's nothing complicated about that basic analysis. Nothing. And it makes, you know, I mean, I know that obviously the Democratic Party and Democratic candidates, even the best ones, are not going to be where I am on this issue yet. Of course not. But I got to tell you, like, I mean, look, in some ways, Bill de Blasio is just such a delusional buffoon. I don't even know what to say. But he's the one who's trying to make himself a thing in 2020. And obviously he'll never be. But the notion that he still is the mayor of New York City, that's an important position, goes to AIPAC and attacks BDS while at the same time, you know, discoursing that he's like the real social democrat candidate. Whoa.
Yeah. And for people to rail against Trump's racism while totally ignoring the racism of Netanyahu and the Israeli state is ridiculous. Like, people could say, oh, it's not about race, it's about, you know, the Jewish people. But like, how do they treat Jews who are not white in Israel?
Absolutely.